When someone dies and their body is cremated, there are a number of ways that their loved ones might choose to remember that person and celebrate their life. But one of the more unusual ways to commemorate the dead is to roll the ashes up into a blunt and get high while smoking their friends' remains. Rumor has it that's exactly what happened to the victim of today's assassination. It's September 1996, a Saturday night in Las Vegas. The Strip is packed, lights flashing, horns blaring. Every corner is humming with glitz and hustle. Inside the MGM Grand, a sold-out crowd watches Mike Tyson step into the ring. And there in the front row, wearing a white tank top, gold chains, black jeans, and his trademark bandana tied at the front, is Tupac Shakur, rapper, actor, and activist. Sitting next to him is Suge Knight, the head of Death Row Records. They're not just label mates, their relationship goes way beyond business. The East Coast versus West Coast hip-hop rivalry has grown beyond lyrics. It's now bullets, bodyguards, and body counts. There's a war going on, and these two are soldiers fighting for the same side. The battle raging in the boxing ring that night is less intense than the action on the street. Tyson knocks out his opponent in just 109 seconds. Tupac and Suge are seen celebrating ringside, laughing, smiling, and soaking up the chaos. After the fight, the crowd spills out into the casino. Tupac moves with his entourage, a dozen men in motion. Out of nowhere, they spot someone. An enemy. Orlando Baby Lane Anderson, 22 years old and a member of rival LA gang, the Southside Compton Crips. A few weeks earlier, he tried to snatch a death row chain of one of Suge's men. Tupac doesn't hesitate. He charges forward and throws a punch. Anderson goes down. Tupac's crew piles on. Kicking, stomping, it's over in less than a minute. Hotel cameras catch everything. Anderson gets up and walks away, bruised, angry, and embarrassed. Tupac returns to his suite at the Luxor and tells his girlfriend, Kidada Jones, what just went down. He changes into fresh clothes and heads to the after party at Club 662. It's around 11 p.m. when he and Suge climb into a black BMW. Suge is driving. Tupac rides up front. Their bodyguards are following in separate cars. They drive through the Vegas night, music up and windows down. At one point, they get pulled over by police for the loud music and some missing plates. The stop is short and they're let go. A few minutes later, they pull up at a red light alongside a car full of women who recognize Tupac and start yelling his name. He leans out the window, smiling and joking with them. A white Cadillac pulls up on the passenger side. The rear window lowers and a hand reaches out, holding a firearm. Hello, my friend. I'm Aslan Pahari, and this is Assassins, the show where we tell the stories of history's most shocking assassinations. And today, we're not talking about a politician or a general or a king. We're talking about a rapper. Well, sort of, because calling Tupac Shakur a rapper is like calling Muhammad Ali a boxer. Sure, it's true, but it's far from the whole story. Tupac was a poet, a performer, and a radical. He might have only been alive for 25 years, but in that time, he became one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. His voice cut through the noise with rage and empathy. His songs weren't just about the streets, they were about systems, poverty, policing, and racism. And then One night, after a fight in Las Vegas, he was shot 4 times and left for dead. The investigation went nowhere. Witnesses vanished. The people who were there at the scene stopped talking. Some of them because they were dead. For decades, one question was left hanging in the air. Who killed Tupac Shakur? This is his story. How he lived, how he fought, and how, nearly 3 decades later, his murder is still being untangled and interrogated. Tupac Amaru Shakur was born in East Harlem in 1971. The name was no accident. His mother, Afeni Shakur, was a member of the Black Panther Party. She was pregnant with Tupac while on trial for conspiring to bomb department stores and police stations. She defended herself in court, and she won. And when her little boy was born, she gave him the name of a revolutionary, Tupac Amaru II, a Peruvian dissident who'd led a rebellion against the Spanish and was executed for it. Tupac's childhood was shaped by activism, instability, and government surveillance. The FBI kept a file on his family. His stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, went underground after being indicted for robbery and murder. His godfather, Geronimo Pratt, served time for a crime he didn't commit. Throughout his childhood, Tupac moved often. First Baltimore, where he studied acting and ballet at the School for the Arts. He read Shakespeare, he wrote poetry, he was charismatic, angry, brilliant, and broke. When he was 17, he moved to California and joined the hip-hop group Digital Underground. His first appearance was as a backup dancer, but he wouldn't stay in the background for long. By 1991, he was out the front, a solo artist in his own right. Now, just a quick note. The ABC can't afford to license Tupac's actual music for the episode, so until we can get some of those bluey dollar bucks, you'll be hearing the best approximation our production music library has for the sound and spirit of Tupac's timeless beats. His debut album, Tupacalypse Now, was political, raw, and unfiltered. Songs like Brenda's Got a Baby and Trapped tackled issues familiar to Tupac and his audience: teen pregnancy, police brutality, and institutional racism. Vice President Dan Quayle called the album a danger to society, and Tupac loved that. He followed it up with Strictly for My N-Word and kept rising. But so did his problems. He was sued, he was arrested, he got into fights, he was attacked by the media, embraced by his fans, and feared by the establishment. At the same time, Hollywood came calling. Tupac starred in the films Juice, Poetic Justice, and Above the Rim. He was magnetic on screen. Studios wanted more of him. But the streets wanted him too. Tupac's rise to fame was happening at the same time an infamous music feud was starting to ramp up: the East Coast versus West Coast hip-hop rivalry. To understand Tupac's story, you have to understand this rivalry. You see, hip-hop was born in the early 1970s on the streets of the Bronx in New York City. The culture and music that arose from this scene has its origins on the East Coast of the USA. This gave many East Coast rappers the sense that their music was superior to that made elsewhere in the US, or around the world for that matter. But throughout the 1980s and early 90s, the West Coast hip-hop scene was thriving off the back of artists like NWA and Dr. Dre. Dre was a co-founder of Death Row Records alongside Suge Knight, and by the early 90s, these West Coast artists were getting fed up with the arrogance of their East Coast counterparts. Sitting at the center of the early 90s East Coast scene was Sean Puff Daddy Combs. founder of Bad Boy Records, which would become home to artists like the notorious B.I.G. For a while, the East and West Coast scenes traded diss tracks, songs that would call out and make fun of or even humiliate their rivals. But soon, the feud spilled over into the real world in a very real way. By the early 1990s, Tupac was famous, but his life was starting to spin out of control. He was watched constantly by his East Coast rivals, by the police, by the media. And he knew it. He wore a bulletproof vest to interviews. He said things like, "I might not live to see next week." And people thought he was being dramatic, but he wasn't. In 1993, while filming Above the Rim, Tupac was accused of sexually assaulting a 19-year-old woman in a hotel room. 3 other men were allegedly involved. The victim said she was forced to perform oral sex while Tupac watched. Tupac said the encounter was consensual and that he fell asleep before anything happened, though he was charged with weapons possession, sexual abuse, and sodomy. Now, this was only the beginning of the young rapper's troubles. Late one night in November 1994, Tupac arrived at Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan. He was due to appear in court to face those charges the following day, but first, he'd promised to record a verse for a friend. He walked into the studio lobby with his brother-in-law and one of his closest friends. As the group arrived, some members of an East Coast group associated with the notorious B.I.G. and Bad Boy Records shouted greetings to Tupac. As Tupac and his buddies stepped inside, they were confronted by 3 men with guns who ordered them to get on the ground. Tupac hesitated, and so they shot him 5 times. Once in the head, once in the groin, once in the thigh, and twice in the arm. The men stole $40,000 worth of jewelry and disappeared into the night. It's something of a miracle, but Tupac survived. As he was taken away on a stretcher, Tupac allegedly flipped the bird to the East Coast crew who were present. The next day, ignoring medical advice, Tupac checked himself out of hospital and showed up to court in a wheelchair for the sexual abuse case hearing. He was acquitted of the sodomy and gun charges, but was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree sexual abuse. If he wanted to stay out of jail until sentencing, Tupac would have to pay bail, set at a whopping $3 million. He couldn't post that amount and surrendered himself to authorities. From behind bars, Tupac gave interviews. He claimed that the Quad Studios shooting was a betrayal and that Puffy and the notorious B.I.G. had been involved. It sounded crazy. Biggie and Tupac were friends. They'd performed together. Biggie had even hung out at Tupac's house. But according to Tupac, too many things didn't add up. Was it just a coincidence that Puffy and Biggie were in the same studio that night? And why did Biggie release a song called Who Shot Ya just months after Tupac was shot? Puffy and Biggie claimed that it was just a coincidence, but Tupac wasn't convinced. The East Coast-West Coast hip-hop rivalry had just kicked up a gear. A case in point. August 1995, and the Source Awards are held in New York City. Suge Knight, the head of Death Row Records, got up on stage and said, "If any artists out there want to be artists and want to stay a star and don't want the executive producer all in the videos, all on the records, dancing, come to Death Row." The crowd gasped. Suge was clearly calling out Puffy, who was known for appearing in his artists' videos and improvising on their tracks. Puffy was at the awards ceremony that night, and the diss didn't go down well at all with the East Coast crowd. They booed Suge, and later booed Dre when he won Producer of the Year. Puffy took to the mic later in the evening, calling for calm in the East Coast-West Coast rivalry. But it didn't do much good. In the months that followed, tensions escalated. At a party in Atlanta, a man close to Suge named Jake Robles, or Big Jake, was shot and killed. Both camps were there. Suge accused Puffy of being behind this shooting as well. All the while, Tupac was in prison, his career on hold. He was drowning in legal costs, surrounded by enemies, and losing hope. And then, Suge Knight showed up. The larger-than-life head of Death Row Records, 6'4", over 130 kilograms, always wearing red, always surrounded by muscle. By this point in time, Tupac was appealing his conviction. He'd had a bond set at $1.4 million. Suge visited Tupac in prison with an offer. Death Row would post Tupac's bond if Tupac signed a 3-album deal with the label. Tupac agreed. In October 1995, after spending 9 months behind bars, Tupac walked out of Clinton Correctional Facility and into the arms of the most feared label in hip-hop. Suge had flown across the country and hired a limo to pick up Tupac from prison. Tupac was back, and he went straight to the studio. In just 2 weeks, he recorded most of All Eyes on Me, a double album that would become his biggest commercial success. It was angry, loud, and defiant. Tupac sounded like a man who knew his time was running out and didn't care who he offended. Then came the track Hit 'Em Up, the B-side to his single How Do You Want It. On the surface, Hit 'Em Up was a diss track responding to Puffy and Biggie's track Who Shot Ya? But it was more than that. It was a threat, and it was targeted. On the track, Tupac accused Biggie of copying his style, of being soft, of being fake, and most explosively, you claim to be a player, but I f***ed your wife. That's right, Tupac said he'd slept with Biggie's wife, Faith Evans. The song wasn't clever, it was cruel. He wasn't just trying to call out Bad Boy Records, he was trying to humiliate them. East Coast versus West Coast was no longer just a headline. It had evolved into something dangerous, real-world dangerous. But the records kept selling, the headlines kept coming, and Tupac kept pushing. He was fearless, maybe reckless, but above all, he believed in loyalty. To Suge, to Death Row, to the West Coast. Even if it killed him. Which brings us back to that Saturday night in Vegas. Suge and Tupac are stopped at a red light. Tupac's flirting with some women in the car alongside them. Just then, a white Cadillac pulls up on the passenger side. The rear window lowers and a hand reaches out holding a firearm. 13 shots are fired. Bullets rip through Suge and Tupac's ride. Tupac is hit 4 times. Once in the arm, once in the thigh, and twice in the chest. One of the bullets lodges in his right lung. Suge is grazed by shrapnel but stays conscious. He floors it, swerves through traffic, and makes a U-turn. It's only a few kilometers before the cops pull them over. Officers see the blood and call for paramedics. One of them leans in and asks Tupac who shot him. And allegedly, Tupac looks up and says, "F*** you." He's rushed to University Medical Center. Doctors perform multiple surgeries, and they even remove a lung. He ends up on life support, but he never regains consciousness. Tupac was shot at one of the busiest intersections in Las Vegas. The strip was packed, dozens of people saw the white Cadillac speed away, and there was no shortage of witnesses. But no arrests were made. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department treated the case as gang-related from the get-go. To them, it was just another violent feud spilling over onto the streets. Dangerous, chaotic, and almost impossible to untangle. Officers spoke to members of Tupac's entourage, but most refused to cooperate. Some said they didn't see anything. Others simply walked away. There was a deep distrust of law enforcement, and no one close to Tupac wanted to be seen talking to the police. The day after the assassination, Orlando Anderson, the guy that Tupac and his crew had beaten up after the Tyson fight, was brought in for questioning. His altercation with Tupac just hours before the shooting had been caught on surveillance cameras. But he denied being involved in Tupac's assassination, and the police chose not to investigate further. Within days, the case began to stall. Leads dried up and public attention shifted. There was talk of retaliation, and then, around 6 months after Tupac was killed, another assassination. March 1997, Christopher Wallace, better known as the notorious B.I.G., is gunned down in Los Angeles in eerily similar circumstances to Tupac. A black vehicle, a busy street, a flurry of shots. He dies instantly. And once again, no one is held accountable. Tupac and Biggie were friends, turned rivals, turned symbols of something bigger than themselves. Their murders are often thought of as twin tragedies, the unsolved heart of a cultural war between coasts, between gangs, and between empires. The questions surrounding Tupac's death never stopped. Conspiracy theories flooded documentaries, podcasts, and internet forums. Some said he faked his own death and escaped to Cuba. Others pointed to the government or the LAPD. Some blamed Suge Knight, and others blamed Puffy. Everyone had a theory, but no one had proof. Even now, nearly 30 years later, the full truth feels out of reach. Tupac was killed on September 13, 1996. He was 25 years old and his body was cremated. According to members of his group, the Outlaws, they took a portion of his ashes, rolled them into a blunt, and smoked them as a tribute. Whether or not this actually happened doesn't really matter. The symbolism said enough. Tupac had become more than a person. To his people, he was a force. In the years that followed, he became even bigger. His music kept being released, his old interviews resurfaced, his face appeared on murals, on t-shirts, and in protests. People didn't just mourn him, they celebrated him. They studied his words, quoted his lines, and shared his vision. He became a symbol of defiance, of resilience, and brilliance. But not everyone agrees on what he represented. Some saw him as a prophet. Some said he was reckless. Others held him up as a martyr. The one thing no one ever said was that he didn't matter. Tupac once said he might not change the world, but he would spark the brain that does. And maybe that's exactly what he did. Thank you for watching, my friend. What's your favorite Tupac track? Let me know in the comments below.